Okay, so my talk is on intermediate CSS, which I will just call you've built your first one or two websites and you run into some problems. So this talk is a highly opinionated talk by a slightly less experienced developer about maybe a better way to write your CSS. I'm not going to call this best practices. I'm not even going to call this good practices. I'm just going to call these probably a little bit better practices if you only built like 2 or 3 websites. Okay, so what's the motivation for this talk? Well, if you build some websites, you might run into things like this, like where you just have section 2 content as one of your CSS selectors, or something like primary menu.subtitle.ul.li.a. And these types of things are, it's hard to maintain. You don't really know what they are a month or 2 months after writing this, and it just makes it a nightmare to go back and try to fix this up. But something like this also results in like very, very brittle code. So this selector will affect this A tag. But what happens if you move this A tag outside of this? If you move it to over here, then this selector's styling no longer applies. So it's very rigid. You have to keep this in order for this styling to apply. And what ends up happening is you run into problems like specificity creep, which means the next selector, you just keep adding on and on and on and more, and you get really, really hard, unmaintainable code. And some other problems that you run into, you have what's called dead code, where in your CSS, you just have a bunch of stylings, maybe hashtag section 2 content, and you move some stuff around, but you're not really sure if this styling is still being used or not. So you just kind of keep that in your style sheet. And the end result of all of this is you have these huge 500 to 1,000 line style sheets that is very bloated. You don't know what goes where, and it's just kind of like a big stream of consciousness. And you also have the worst part of CSS is the cascading parts of it, cascading style sheets, which means one part of the style sheet affects something else, which affects something else, which affects something else, and it's just impossible to track. So hopefully this talk will help you resolve some of these issues and write more maintainable CSS. So here's the joke. 2 CSS properties walk into a bar stool in a completely different bar falls over. And this just goes back to the fact that CSS all have effects on each other. There's so much side effects, and it's really difficult to know what will affect what. So this gets back to the main point of this talk, which is that writing CSS is really easy, but maintaining CSS is actually super, super hard. So pretty much almost all the problems with CSS comes back to naming CSS. And when you want to name CSS, there's 3 main things that I think are really important. First is that you want CSS that's easy to understand its purpose in the actual CSS. So in your style sheets, if I see something like hashtag section 2 ID, what does that mean? It's really difficult to know what it means. And ideally, I want to have CSS where the CSS names are named something that I can mentally construct how the web page will look just by looking at the style sheet. That's ideal. And the reverse of that is I also want really meaningful CSS in HTML. So if I have a div and I have class 1, class 2, class 3, this is really meaningless. I don't really know what each one of these things does. And that means I have to go back into the style sheet and try to figure this out. And that takes a lot of time. And the third thing that I think is really important when writing CSS is that we want CSS names that are easy to write. So I don't have to stay here and think for 2 minutes to come up with a name for the CSS property. So I just want CSS that's really easy to write and that's really easy to understand from an HTML side and from a CSS side. And in general, we want CSS that's flat, meaning that you don't have this super high specificity. You want CSS that's robust, so changing one div to another place doesn't just break everything. And you also want CSS that's really dry, so you just don't have really big style sheets. Everything's really simple and maintainable. So I think this is like a kind of like the philosophy for how we should write CSS. So what's a solution to this? BEM. So BEM stands for Block Element Modifier, and this is a very popular kind of philosophy for how you can write CSS. The way that I like to think about this is block is really just a component, and element is just a part of a component, and the modifier is kind of like a state. So as an example, here's Google Gmail. And so we're just going to look at this part, which is the nav. So a block, which would be the component, would be just the nav bar. An item could just be these individual items here, these elements. So these are the individual elements. And then a modifier could just be that this is active. It's just a state. So modifiers could be it's active, it's hovered, or something else. So this is called BEM. So we'll look into this right here. So I just pulled this off of Dribble, and this is just a simple web interface that I found online. And how could we construct this in BEM? So the entire idea of BEM is that you want to kind of split your websites up into components, into visual logical components. So this could be a component right here. This could be a component right here. And like these cards are kind of components. And so if we were to write the CSS here, I might have this entire component just called a movie card. And this image here is just movie card and image. Movie card description box, which is this box right here. And then you have a title, tags, and then a runtime. And the benefit of this is that everything's really, really flat. I could take this box out and it wouldn't affect anything else. And so what I mean by this is that this code is super modular. Because all my code is prefixed with a movie card, I know that the CSS I write for this won't affect anything other than the movie card. It also makes it very flat because everything is just one specificity. So there's no side effects at all. I know that everything that's for this for movie card title will only affect movie card title. And this is really logical, and I don't have to think for 2 minutes about how to name everything. Okay, so this is all really well and good, but there is one problem though. This is really good for building like interfaces, but what happens if you run into this? So this I just pulled from Starbucks' website. What would you call like this component, or this component, or this component, or this component, where everything is sort of similar, but just a little bit different? The layout's just a little bit different. And, or for instance, let's say we have this layout where we just have 3 headers and they're just all just a little bit different. This one has just more margin. This one's just a different color, and this one's just aligned differently. Do we just name it header 1, header 2, header 3? Like, how would you logically name this? And so this is kind of the second main, I guess, way of writing CSS, which is I would recommend for kind of very content-heavy sites, which is an atomic approach. So if you were to go to Atomic CSS, their way of writing CSS is everything's in just these classes, and it just kind of gets rendered like in real time. So so this thing right here is just this class determines the background color. This one is the text color, and this right here is just the text font. So the benefit of writing CSS like this is that you can really easily tell from reading your actual HTML files what everything does. It's very clear how everything affects everything. And so this makes it really useful. For instance, if we're writing a bunch of button classes, like these are all very, very similar, but they're just a little bit different. So instead of having to write 25 different classes, I could actually do this a lot quicker by using things called utility classes. So what are utility classes? Utility classes are pretty much what I was just hinting at. It's that I can, for a lot of very common things, I can just make a class called center, and in it, I just have text align center, or a class called margin top 15. And the only thing in this class is I set margin top 15. So it lets me reuse a lot of these really common components. So I don't have to write a CSS class for this, a CSS class for this, and a CSS class for this. And so if we were to go back and write these classes, we could pretty much just logically split all these different button classes into just 3 different things. I can have a button shape, a button size, and just a button color. And as long as I have a button color that's red, orange, blue, green, and large, another blue button shape, just a rectangle, a hollow on the inside, and these things, I could just mix and match these classes and be able to generate all these different buttons on the fly. Okay, so back to what we said earlier. For CSS, you want things that's easy to understand in its CSS and easy to understand in HTML. And so I kind of presented 2 different ways of doing that. One is this right here is style sheet semantic, right? Like these styles are really easy to understand from a style sheet perspective. It's style-wise meaningful. And then you also have things like these, which are content semantic, which is that it's very, if I were to look at a style sheet, I can very easily see how everything will render together. But like, what happens if I want to have my cake and kind of eat it at the same time? What happens if I want just like everything? And so this gets to the next topic, which is Sass. So if you're not familiar with Sass, there's another lightning talk about this by Michaela, which is really, really serves as kind of like a basis for this. But Sass has a lot of different properties, but I'm just going to talk about 3 properties that I think you can use to make kind of all of these things come together, and that you can write CSS that's easy to understand in CSS, easy to understand in HTML. It's easy to write, it's very flat, it's robust, and it's very dry. So 3 things, 3 really the only things that you need to know about Sass to get started is that in Sass we can have variables. So I can call red primary color, or it could just be something else like hashtag DDDDD for a color. And you can set any kind of property as a variable. So I can have primary color, I can have a border width, and I can also kind of inject one CSS property into a bunch of different places. So for instance, what if as kind of like a overall web style, I just want everything here to just have borders. And I want the borders to be red, 1 pixel, and solid. So I just want all of this in these things. I could just create a border class and extend these into all of these things. And what happens is that this style will just get injected into all of these things. And so later on, if instead of having the border just be 1 pixel, I want it to be 2 pixels for all my styles, I just have to change this from 1 pixel to 2 pixel. And same thing with red, or for instance, if I just want to have an entirely different border styling, I could just do it in here, and that would just get rendered into each one of these places. And then the last thing that's really interesting about Sass is this and sign. And what this really just means is that when this Sass gets rendered, it just gets rendered into .moviecard __ image. And so this and thing is just a placeholder for like the class that was just that this thing is in. So this just gets rendered into these class selectors. And the other nice thing about writing styles like this in this kind of nested format is from this, I can pretty easily tell how everything could pretty much look in my HTML. I have an image, I have a description box, and this is all nested inside of movie card. And because of this, I can very visually just kind of split things up. And the last thing that's really nice about Sass is that you can have things that are called partials. So this right here would just go in a file called underscore card.sass, and it would just, and then in the end, all of these things would get put together into one long CSS file. And I think Rails gives you that for free. And so that's the end of the talk.
I was muted. So yeah, does anybody have any questions for John? One question I would have is, how did you like learn about this? Did you just like read blog posts? Did you just try a bunch of different approaches? I feel like my approach to CSS is like hack it until it works, and then it works, and I just kind of move on to the next thing. So I guess, what's your approach to refactoring and like just your thought process behind this stuff?
Yeah, so I did spend a lot of time reading different blog posts, trying to come up with like the best way of writing it. And that's why I just call this a better approach, because it's still just kind of experimenting and trying to figure out things on the fly. And it's kind of a combination of all three of these things, which is figuring out the best practices by the people in the community, testing things out, and also just kind of going by a lot of like, if you're doing Angular code or React code, they all kind of have their own philosophies, and it's just kind of combining all these things together and trying to figure out what's right.
Yeah, I can definitely see this playing really well with like React or Angular, like really well. So that's really cool. Anybody else have any other questions?
I got a question.
Yeah.
So do you just kind of go something like, when you start a project, say, like rather than just sit and stare at the screen trying to figure out exactly what you're going to call everything, like what do you just go back and like once you figure it out and then kind of revamp it as you go, or do you plan out a whole bunch up front? Like what's your personal preference for, I guess?
So I kind of use a lot of the same vocabulary. So so if I'm building up, so I try to keep things very descriptive. And after you build a lot, a good maybe 4 or 5 websites, components are pretty similar. They're just, you have containers, you have cards, you have boxes, and you just try to keep it as contextual as possible. So maybe that's pretty much it.
That's cool.
Yeah,
I definitely pretty deeper meaning or anything. Really just like practically what your preference is. So
yeah, I think once you start doing things like the BEM way, things kind of just fall into place, because you don't have to spend so long trying to come up with what the name is. It's whatever this thing is, and then it has elements, and then it has modifiers. And so when I'm writing CSS, I really don't think that much time about it. You might have like, and I think a key part of this is to just kind of plan things out ahead of time. If you look at your designs ahead of time, you should have a good idea. And if things are like really difficult, like if you have 3-4 different nav bars, I think that's probably a hint that you should be trying to take the second approach, which is just trying to figure out the similar components and kind of build it in like an atomic way.
I think also a few things I've learned is naming things how you see them. So basically the WYSIWYG style. So if you are building a movie database, this will be my movie. This is the movie's title. This is the movie's description. Naming things that way makes things super easy when you're going back to your CSS to start writing it. And then you're like, oh crap, now this doesn't work on mobile. What was that called? And a lot of that. The other thing is, if you don't have good wireframes before you start, that's where my big struggle is. If I don't have a solid design down, my mind goes in a million directions with millions of inspirations. Then I start naming things weird, and I start designing things weird, and it just looks like garbage. So start out with a solid design first, and then make it simple on yourself from then out. And then it's just basically you write your HTML, how you see it from your design, and then you go into your CSS, and it makes things a lot easier.
Yeah, definitely having good designs to start off with is really, really important. Definitely +1 to that.
How do you deal with, so like in like React, or like what I'm thinking about is like the component structure, and you have like components, and sometimes a component will have a subcomponent within the component. And all of a sudden, if you're using the BEM style, I can see sort of wanting to fall back into the old? Do you sort of see what the question is sort of like if you have a sub-component within a bigger component, and do you like, is it just like you don't like fall victim to the urge of being like, oh, only within this subcomponent I want this custom? Do you see what I'm asking?
Yeah. So the question is like, if you have like one component which has a part inside a part, how do you deal with that? If the parts are not that complicated, so let me go back to the card example.
So we can't see your screen. Oh, perfect.
Yeah. So so if I have something like this, oops. Yeah. So I have this like wrapper. I just call it movie card description box that goes around this. And even though the title, the tags, and the runtime are inside this description box, I'm still only doing this one layer deep. I'm calling it movie card underscore title. And the reason for this is that in BEM, you don't want to have movie card description box title because this keeps everything just one layer flat. So later on, if I want to change this up, like if I just want to have the Great Gatsby up here, it won't break because I've taken it outside of this description box. If you have things 3 or 4 component layers deep, that is probably like a hint that maybe you have, you should try to split these things up into smaller components. So I think it's really those two main things. Split them up or just nest things one layer deep.
Super interesting. Cool, good stuff. Does anybody else have any other questions?
Have you talked with anybody about the increase of this? Because lately I've been looking at certain websites when I look for inspiration and look at the code and stuff like that, and I'm seeing this more and more frequently, more explicit, wording and how things are written versus. I mean, you can tell when it's a Bootstrap site, or you can tell when it's a framework site because they're exactly the same, and then you can tell when it's a from the ground up site where they have very explicit names.
Yeah, there's definitely 3 main big, from like a content semantic perspective of writing CSS. There's just BEM, there's object-oriented CSS, and there's SMA CSS, but they're all really, really similar. And there's definitely a convergence towards writing things in the BEM way. Google just had their like big tech conference like last month, and I was watching one of the talks, and in it, while they're writing CSS, they were writing it in the BEM style. So I think that there's a lot of developers that even if they don't follow a purely BEM way of writing things, they still try to kind of follow that pattern. So does that answer your question? I'm not sure if that answers the question.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
More informed. I've been seeing a lot of Medium articles written about it. I've been seeing a lot of more articles pop up within 2016 and the new trends for 2016 web design and stuff like that. And that's one of the things that I've noticed increasingly.
The reason, I think one of the big reasons for that is right now, if you're looking at like front-end development, everything is kind of trending towards like components, where you build React and Angular are both doing this, where you build a nav bar component or you build, like a card component. And usually when those things are structured, you just have one folder that has your HTML, your JavaScript, and your CSS for that. And BEM is kind of just really, really good for writing it that way. So I think a lot of people are kind of adopting this system.
Right.